a lot of times, especially in the marketing world, we're sort of taught to just sort of brand ourselves like, oh, look, I just kind of popped out of this womb and I knew all this and I figured it all out on my own. And it's very like that individualism of white supremacy culture. And I think it's an act of resistance to say, no, like I stand on the shoulders of giants and these are some of my teachers and these are some of, who I've learned from and built upon.
Three, two, one. Welcome to the Campfire Circle. I'm your host, Tanya Bhattacharya, and I empower purpose-driven women in building influential personal brands that drive change and raise revenue. We all talk about getting a seat at the table, but why though? Who wants to sit in a stuffy boardroom anyway? Let's reimagine the ultimate space of leadership as a campfire circle, where we share stories that inspire movements, build brave communities to huddle together with for warmth, and where there is always room. Come sit with us. Emily Roh is an anti-racist life coach and facilitator for people of color and organizations who want to make this world a more just and equitable place. As a coach, Emily works with her clients to unpack internalized white supremacy and transform their relationships with themselves through courageous self-compassion. She uses somatic and embodiment techniques to help clients get out of their head and tap into the wisdom of their bodies, which I can personally attest to their magic and their usefulness. So, Emily, I'm so excited to be with you today. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here too.
Oh, it's so nice to be with you. I feel like, this feels like being in a cozy blanket, being with you in some ways. And, and that's because you and I have had the opportunity to really build a cozy working relationship by actually kind of trading services, which is a very old way of doing business, when you think about it, one that I think requires deep trust, deep relationship. And I know we'll explore that more a little later. But first things first, Emily, I would love for you to share with us your story and what you have grown through to become the guide you are today.
Oh my goodness, where do I start? I mean, like, do I go back to my ancestors? No, I won't do that to you all. So I'll just start from my life cycle, which is 40 some odd years ago. I was born to evangelical Korean immigrants living in the LA area. And so I just grew up in this like ethnic bubble, right, for the first 5 years of my life. And then when I hit school, I was like thrust into this world that no one prepared me for, right? And no one sort of held me through that process. I was just expected to figure it out on my own. And I know I'm not the only one who struggles or experiences this, but it very much shaped my perception of myself and just sort of my place in the world. And so growing up, I just always felt like an outsider because the bubble I grew up in lived far away. My parents commuted to a church that was farther away. So like everyone else went to church together and school together, right? And here I was coming in once or a few times a week, depending. And then, in school, there was a lot of other Asian kids, but it was predominantly a Vietnamese community. And me and my brother were like the only Korean kids in the school. So there was like constantly this outsider feeling growing up. By the time I got to high school, right, all of this had really messed with me. And I basically tried to be as white as possible, right? Because I'm a teenager, I'm trying to fit in, I want a friend, and I'm like extremely socially awkward, really had terrible self-esteem. I mean, what teenage girl doesn't, let's be honest. But I thought that trying to fit in would be my way, towards belonging. And that just really wasn't the case. It's interesting because I think once I embraced my own uniqueness and weirdness, that's when I really started to blossom. And that also happened in conjunction to going to college and when I studied Asian American studies, because that was like the first time I had ever taken ethnic studies classes. I had seen myself reflected in the classroom. It gave me a lot of language and framework for understanding the world and just completely shifted my worldview. Right. But it was like super intellectual. I went to UCLA. So it was all about being in our heads, all about rational arguments, all about research. And, I'm in my 20s by this point. So I think I have it all figured out. Right. I got this. And then I went out into the world and just like the world just like smacked me in the face. And I was like, sorry, it's not that simple, right? It's not. So like, I just had this very like linear framework about like what was right or wrong. It was very black, white. And I just found myself in situations where like, I don't want to disclose things because they're not my story to tell, but basically where it really like shattered my sense of like, oh, it doesn't work in that framework. It doesn't work for every situation. And what I learned through that is the importance of just being compassionate and of seeing people as individuals and not just their identities, right? And so it brought this like spiritual piece into my work because Asian American Studies fired me up. It was like, okay, that's it. My life's work is in social justice. But like, I think I was causing a lot of harm still in trying to do what was good. And so the spiritual piece, I think, just really tempered a lot of that. And then I had a very long career in education, working in everywhere from high schools to, colleges and universities. And, I wasn't happy, right? It was a lot of gaslighting. It was a lot of like, well, we believe in this, but like, administrators, leadership's actions always, did not line up to what they espoused they valued. I mean, their budget certainly didn't, right? And so I was just getting gradually more and more disillusioned with my work and searching, like trying to figure out what it is I really want to do with my life. My passion has always been people development. I always love helping people grow and become the best versions of themselves they possibly can. And then my other passion, of course, has been like the social justice work. So when I got laid off in the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, let me tell you, that was a really rough week because that was the same week that George Floyd was murdered by the police. And so that week is like burned into my memory. And it was really hard because I'd never been laid off before. I'd never experienced that kind of loss. But it also, like, when, through the tears, through the crying, through the processing, the seeds sort of started forming around like, what if this is an opportunity, right? What if this, like, well, first of all, unemployment was like a sustainable amount of income for like the first time in my adult life, right? So I was like, what if this is an opportunity? What if I can actually take this and do what I've always wanted to do, which is like merge that people development with the anti-racist work? And that's how I landed at coaching, and that was about, a little over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's been really a process. It's been such a journey. I know we'll get more into that later, so I don't want to give too much away, but it's been a really wonderful journey about learning, just learning from the body and the body's wisdom and the body's knowing and just coupling that through the lens of like what I know from like my social justice experience and my social justice education. So yeah.
Oh my goodness. I resonate with your stories. As you know, as you and I have talked about, when I ask this question about people's stories, I always have like core memories unlock of my own story that reflect back what people are saying. And what came up for me was in high school, I actually got voted most unique despite my biggest efforts to fit in. So I don't know how that happened, but I remember being so embarrassed. Like I did not want to stick out. And that was like not a happy thing to be voted. Yeah. I thought it was, but looking back on that now, actually, when we get to be unique and celebrate our own humanity and like really stand out for who we are, that is actually how we relate to people. That is how we get things done. And you mentioned, getting out of our heads and into our bodies. And, as a fellow daughter of Asian immigrants, I know how much emphasis is put on education, on cognition, on grades, on credentials, on GPAs, and all that external success stuff. And, I get why, that was that was how we got here. That was how we created success for ourselves in generations gone by. And now, as I think about it in my ongoing reps towards personal development work and thought leadership work, I'm realizing and feeling how much those things don't matter. It's actually like relearning how to be human, as human as possible, building back that relationship with ourself with a capital S, which you taught me. And so I would love for you to share with me and our listeners a little bit about the framework that you use to help people get back in touch with their humanity and really tend to that relationship with their self.
Yeah, I think the best way I can think of how to describe it, there's like and I want to contrast it with how I was taught growing up, which is like, in the Christian framework, it's very much like original sin. You are sinful and you need Jesus to save you, right? And so, in terms of what I grew up believing I was inherently unworthy, right? And so then, meeting my parents' expectations, the high pressure academic environment, oh my gosh. And that's really being connected to my sense of worth was what I had to unpack. And so when I learned about this Buddhist perception or Buddhist framework, I don't know if the right word is, but like the belief there is that we are like inherently good. We are inherently like gold, right? And then what life does to us is like it sort of builds, it's like layers and layers of grime on top of that gold, right? That's like, the shoulds in our heads and, what we need to do in order to prove our worth or belong or what have you, right? And so then the work is really about scraping away the grime and returning to our inner goodness. And that's really how I approach coaching. So just that framework, right? That people are already whole and they are just simply stepping into a greater sense of their wholeness has been really an important framework or principle for me to follow. Because, yeah, racism wants us to believe that we're not, right? The racism wants us to stay small. And so when we challenge that belief, I feel like that's a really big unpacking, right, of all the stuff we've internalized. The other thing I'd like to say is that, like, and we've talked about this, right? Oppression is traumatic, right? And I think of trauma like really as a big spectrum, right? We have trauma with like the big T where, you're getting PTSD diagnoses, you've gone through some really horrible things in your life. And I tend to think of that as trauma with a big T, and then trauma with a lowercase t is sort of just like the daily microaggressions and beliefs that we're, fronted with on a daily basis. Like, if you don't get straight A's, then you're not a good person or you're not a good daughter or what have you, right? Like those things build up and cause trauma in our bodies. The reason this happens, in my worldview, is that colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy want to dehumanize us, want us to disconnect from ourselves and each other in order to exploit us, right? And wants to disconnect us from the earth so that it can exploit the resources of the earth, which is very successful at doing it right now. And so we take all this and we're living in this place where we're gaslit, we're unworthy, we're disconnected from ourselves, right? And then when clients come to me, they're coming to me with a place of like, I just feel angry all the time, right? Or I'm like, I feel stuck, or, I'm really afraid, right? But because they're so disconnected, there's no space that, we've created in our society to really hold each other, exploring that. That's the work I get to do as a coach. And so that trauma that we experience on a daily basis is really stored in our bodies. And there's a lot of neuroscience and neurobiology research like demonstrating this now. I should say measuring and capturing things that, indigenous cultures around the world already knew for many, many years, right? Let's just be honest. And it's just being repackaged under the guise of science and giving that quote unquote legitimacy, right? And so my work is really about healing and liberation, right? So like whatever white supremacy is doing, whatever, capitalism and colonization is doing, I'm interested in looking at what's the opposite of that, right? So white supremacy culture is like perfectionism. So my antidote is like, how do we then play in this space? We don't get it right, but how do we explore, right? How do we reconnect with our bodies and our feelings? And our feelings, like when we feel our feelings, can we notice what happens to our body? Where do we feel those senses of constriction? Where do we feel that weight? Where do we feel that tension and tightness? And then just by really mindfully and gently being with whatever's happening, right? It allows whatever's there room to breathe, room to let go, room to unlock, right? And then, that's the healing process, right? Like that unlocking the feeling of being more calm and centered and compassionate with yourself and others, more curious, more grounded, more centered, right? And that's what happens in each coaching session. And then the healing is like a spiral, right? It's not linear.
Mm-hmm.
So clients come back and they keep on bumping up against the same thing, but there's a slow evolution in what that experience is like. And they're able to access their selves with a capital S quicker, faster, right? And then that's our lifelong work, right? All of us.
Right. This work is so important just to become a more realized, more self-expressed human. But it's also important just because my lane is kind of this work of thought leadership and change making and getting visible as a go-to kind of expert. And all of those things actually thwart us from being able to do that. And one of the things that you led me through in our coaching work was actually parts work. And I think that was just such an important thing because it helped me identify that those voices, or what I like to call the itty bitty shitty committee, or the inner chaperone, or the inner critic, like that's not actually me. That's not me. You know, those imposter thoughts, those overworking thoughts, those urgent thoughts, like that was part of myself that had to fracture off as a protective response, you know, to little T trauma, you know, not necessarily big T trauma, but all the little T trauma, all the plaque that developed on my tooth, I guess, you know, from living life. And you know what else? I think, you know, none of this was by accident. Like the fact that this plaque develops on us, it's not an accident. Like that was designed, right?
Yep.
That was designed.
Absolutely. To keep us small, to keep us afraid.
Small. That's it. So everything stays the same. Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And a small minority get to hoard the resources of the entire world while so many people suffer. Right?
And I can see a reflection of that small oppressive, like I can see a reflection of that in my parts. Like you and I have worked on my part, Scrooge, which I have lovingly named Scrooge McDuck, which is my like overworking, urgent, like capitalist little voice that I carry around in me that's wondering why I don't have like, you know, more. Why don't I have more? Even though I have enough, I have plenty. My cup really runneth over, but it's always telling me to, you know, get more. But through parts work and through our work together, I've really been able to make that like voice a whisper in the wind instead of the one driving me around in the car, right? But like you said, it is a spiral because sometimes that voice gets really loud and then sometimes it's quiet and sometimes it's loud and sometimes it's quiet. So it's ongoing.
Yeah. And with parts work, I want to be very clear. The goal is not to get rid of Scrooge McDuck, right? Right. Like there's a reason he's there. There's a reason he's trying and how he's trying to help you. And the goal is to shift the relationship, right? Rather than like it being a fight.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than sort of being at odds and having that internal battle, how do you like work with him? How do you let him share his concerns with you so that, you know, you can keep that in mind moving forward? And so it's a really powerful methodology that is part of my practice for sure.
It's like developing a team.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, it's sort of like an internal war, right? Or a battle with everyone kind of for themselves. Or maybe there's like teams of 2 and 3 here and there. How do you get everyone working together? The other thing I want to say too is like parts can also come from, I think, our ancestors and the big T trauma they've experienced.
Yeah.
Like my parents are survivors of war. My mom was born 2 weeks after the Korean War started. I think about what that did to her in her, like, you know, growing up in a post-war, you know, very poor situation. And so like, you know, those were passed down to me biologically because like half of my genetic code was in her when she was born, right? And our genes are activated by our environment. And then also, you know, in how she raised me, right? It's nature and nurture.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so spot on. And even from our first session, you were able to really notice like an ancient grief that was there. You were able to hold that with me, which I appreciate because I think that's important for us to remember as, again, like taking it back to kind of my swim lane when I work with people around like getting visible on LinkedIn. It's not just their person. It's all the ancestral stuff that is coming up at that same time around fear of getting visible and, you know, what standing out meant back then, you know, it's real. It's real.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have worked together in this super collaborative, unique, interesting way and kind of trade some services in which you provided really liberatory, anti-racist life coaching for me. And I got to provide some insight and consulting around like your website copy and thought leadership brand. So, well, I think you were the one who kind of brought that idea to the table. Like, where did that idea come from?
Yeah. So a few things. One is like, I was really playing with how to shift out of this capitalistic, mindset of like transactional. And so what I often say to myself is it's relational, not transactional. And so like I saw it as an opportunity to start a relationship with you first and foremost, not to extract from you or have you extract from me. The other piece I will say is I think I also got the idea from Business for the People, which is a space I work. Well, it's now inactive, but it was started by Toy Marie Smith, who just created a space for entrepreneurs who wanted to do business from an anti-capitalist lens. And so that's something that she kind of brought into the structure of the space. And I thought that was really interesting, but I didn't see anyone there who kind of had what I needed in terms of marketing. And so I was like, it was just a gut, like, voice me like, maybe Tanya is willing to try this with me.
Yeah.
Why don't I ask her and see what she says? And, well, the other thing I will say too is that I had very intentionally offered you a few free coaching sessions so you could experience it. So that could actually help you with my writing and thought leadership.
Right.
And so around my brand. And so I did that intentionally, not for many reasons. One of, it being to help me, but also to get to know you better. And then so when I brought up the trade option, you already knew what you were saying yes to, right? It wasn't like, oh, I don't know. So I had to take some risk there, but I think it worked out because there was a lot of trust. We built the relationship together. I think coaching really helped us build trust together. And we trusted each other in our areas of expertise, right? And it was very collaborative. I think that was like a big green flag for me, is like how willing you were to like take feedback and modify and say, like, when I push back, you were like, yeah, okay, and so I knew that would work, right? Versus someone who might have like gotten a little butthurt about it or something, right? There was like a sense of you as a person that made me willing to also say, maybe to approach you, right? And then my general philosophy is like the worst thing she can do is say no, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what that really evokes for me too is what you were saying earlier. Like instead of like this, being able to play in our relationships. And, instead of leaning into this perfectionist, like, oh, if she says no, I'm going to make this mean this. And I'm going to make this mean that my coaching isn't worth it. I'm going to make this mean that. It's just like about play. And it's just about seeing what can happen and what possibilities can emerge, which I think is so cool. And it was really helpful actually to work together in that way, because I too have a kind of a slant towards big words. like I went to UC Irvine, like I'm going to try and use as many big words as possible. And, I grew up thinking that was like the way. And in some spaces that is, but, I remember in our collaboration, part of the issue, not even issue, but part of what was happening is I'd come to the table with these like big words, like, well, actually precise words, maybe like even, yeah, I'm trying to think of a word, like even sometimes using the phrase white supremacy, like right off the bat in your like introductory language to someone who's just discovering you for the first time, like that might not be the way, because the person who's just showing up and they just feel numb and stuck and angry, they don't know that white supremacy is what has done this to them, so using different language and figuring out how to meet people where they're at through language, because truthfully, like from a working perspective, like what you do it almost defies words, right? And that's the point. It's about getting out. Well, really, it's about getting out of our minds and into our bodies. And so being able to conjure the words that really fit the flavor of what you do, I think really requires that working relationship and that trust and that collaboration and willing to get things wrong and all of that kind of good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it allowed something really beautiful to emerge, which I think, Yeah, I think it felt reciprocal, right? Like I wanted to make sure you were taken care of and I felt taken care of in return. And
Yeah.
again, that was a really wonderful green flag. I laugh about the big words because yeah, that is something I remember that first tagline we came up with together, and
Yeah.
I was like, yes, this is like, I'm a total wordsmith too. So I was like, yes, this is so accurate. And then I took it to some people, and they're like, what the hell does that mean? Right? And I was like, okay, that's not gonna work, right? Like because accessibility is so important to me as a
Right.
value, and so yeah, and I think what you're also naming is the limitations of words, right?
Yes.
Like we live in a
Yes.
very word heavy culture, which is very left brain, which is very like objective and factual and coherent. And sometimes we need to be in the right brain where it doesn't make sense. It's a little more chaotic. It's more creative and intuitive. I don't know why this feels right, but it feels right, and I'm going to follow it. Or I'm going to express myself through art or dance, or singing.
Yes. Oh, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I think that we can have multiple audiences because I remember that first tagline we came up with, and I wish I like had it handy. I don't, but I do think that something like that, which is very like precise and maybe academic, could be a fit for like a conference that you go to or something. But when you're
Mhm.
talking directly to the end user or the person that you're looking to collaborate with, yeah, it's more about like a vibe or a feeling. And so
Mhm.
sometimes, I think you and other folks that we're connected to through like our follow-up community, the kindling community, do a great job of doing videos, do a great job of doing art.
Mhm.
There's different ways to express your messaging.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, if anything you're hearing today inspires you to get more visible as a go-to trusted voice for your audience and drive change towards your deeper mission, I've got something for you. LinkedIn is my favorite place to share my stories and build relationships with my co-conspirators and brand new friends. So I put together a free resource with 14 prompts to create your next post on LinkedIn. Take all the guesswork out of what to say and just start building your impact and influence. Be sure to tag me in your post so I can come by, cheer you on, and amplify your message. You can find those free prompts in the show notes. Okay, back to the episode. That being said, my medium really does tend to be words. And one of the things I really appreciate about you and your values and the way you show up in the world is how you really ensure that your words reflect those values, there's no shaming, there's no blaming in your words. I think you've really tried to remove urgency, from your marketing messages. And I think that as both you and I have made this transition from like, well, you worked in higher education and I worked at a mental health nonprofit. And now we're kind of adjacent to this new world of online business, like not quite
Yeah.
there, but like there. And there's things that can feel funky in our bodies, like these like big countdown timers and like
Mhm.
pressing on
Mhm.
points and messaging. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, how do you really go about making sure that your messaging really reflects your values?
I think it's actually in reverse. I think my values guide my words and actions. I start from like what's important. There's this concept in education called backwards design. And so
Mm,
when you're designing a lesson plan, you start with a goal in mind. Where do we want to be by the end of the whatever, right? What is the intention? What is the purpose? And so I take that and very loosely apply it to everything, right? Like, what is it that I'm trying to do here? How do I make sure that's in alignment with who I am and what I stand for? And honestly, my body, again, tells me a lot of times whether that feels good or not. Like when I'm looking to make a decision, I've learned to really tune in. And if it doesn't feel good, that's a pretty big warning flag that I shouldn't do it. And it takes, I will say though, there is a discernment process I've learned where it's like, okay, do I feel gross or do I just feel uncomfortable? Right?
mm.
Between the two is really, really important. Or is this like a hell yes that I'm feeling in my body? Like, does my body say, oh, absolutely? So I think just that level of intentionality is always present. Another big value, I don't exactly list it on my website because I have like so many values, right? But one of them is integrity. And so
Yeah.
like wanting that like intentionally combined with integrity, I think really shows up a lot in my language. And then I also think about, like, I do quarterly retreats with a couple friends around our businesses, and we set, year-long intentions, quarterly intentions, goals that are, again, very intentional. And so that kind of serves as like a grounding for like how I move in my business. And right now, as I'm preparing for quarter 3, like, one of my focus is rest and spaciousness. I intentionally wrote it down as a goal to remind myself not to be urgent, to remind myself not to stress myself out unnecessarily. Because what is that doing to my body? Right? I feel it when I can't sleep well, when I, you know, my shoulders are tight, I've been still too long, and so that's a good reminder to do something like take a walk or do a little Pilates or something. Yeah.
Yeah. You're so right. Our bodies really do have the answer. And oftentimes, like, it's that gut feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet I think so many of us have lost that relationship with our body. Like, we're just numb. Like, we just don't even know how to listen to the wisdom that's coming out of it, or, that we feel in it. And so, I'm curious. I think that discernment and distinction between, like, do I feel gross or am I uncomfortable? Like, can you speak to that can you speak to that deeper? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think when I'm tuning in, like, there's several things I'm thinking about. One, like, I think I feel gross when it's not in alignment with my values.
Yeah.
So that's I think a barometer, right? Of like, oh, if I'm feeling gross, like, what is this not lining up to for me? Or if I'm really just feeling uncomfortable, is it like, then it's like, do I want to push past that, right? Is the goal or purpose of whatever I'm doing worth it? Like right now, this is very uncomfortable for me, but I'm pushing through because I'm trying to stretch and grow as a business person.
Right.
So it feels, it's not great, but like I sense there's a bigger purpose to it that I can tell, right? Growth is always like generally a personal growth, let me say, is generally a value that I hold pretty strongly. And then the other thing I'm also scanning for in my body is like relationally, right? Because all this work happens in relationship. And so like, what is my sense of like the person I'm working with? Do I feel like I can trust them? Would they, do they get what I'm trying to do? Are they trying to do something similar? Like, where's our alignment there? Right. And so that also shows up in my body. Like, oh, is this someone that I'm like gravitating towards? Or is this someone I'm like, I'm not sure about? And there's this book I'm reading about marketing called The Widest Net by Pamela Slim. And she often talks about how like, or not often, but she mentions how maybes are often no's. And so I kind of taken that to heart as like, if it's a maybe, it's probably a no. And I have the problem where like my eyes are bigger than my stomach, right? And so like I want to do all the things. And so I've learned to really that pausing and figuring out like where does it fit on my priorities, and do I want to give up my rest and spaciousness for that, right? Is a really important question to ask myself before I say yes to something.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's so good. I'm the same way, as you know, like I very much, I'm like, why isn't this done already? Talking to myself, not to anyone else. But rest is a goal too. Rest is a goal too. And I think if we lean into this concept of like cathedral thinking and knowing that like what we're trying to get done, it surpasses just right now. It actually goes into like generations from now. I think we can remember that we're working with a much longer time period than right now. We can get out of right now.
And it's also like a rep, right? To practice.
Yeah.
Because we're so bad at it because of the way we've been trained. I mean, even thinking about, this is a little bit of a side, but, like I have a 6-year-old daughter, and, this year was her first full year in person. And, in the morning I found myself rushing her. Gotta get to school on time, gotta get to school. And then I stopped and asked myself, why? What am I teaching her? What's so important? Right? And that's like, I felt like I was teaching her urgency, right? For the simple reason that, school starts at a certain time, and I'm, as a parent, right, it looks poorly on me if I don't have my daughter adhering to that, right? There can be some shame. There's a lot of parent judgment right out there. And so there can be some feeling around that. And I decided to really just let that go. I'm not perfect at it because sometimes I still rush her a little bit, but I'm like, this education system is about preparing her to be a worker in a capitalist society.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to teach her that lesson over her like agency and choice.
Yes. And well-being. And yeah, that's such a great example. I think hanging out with young people, with kids, I'm not a parent myself, but hanging out with young people is the greatest kind of like education and reminder of what we were like before all this like plaque and guck ended up accumulating on us. They're still fresh. They're still fresh, and we can learn so much from them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh my gosh. Well, you have such beautiful dreams for the world. You are clear in how your work is leading to that vision. You do what you say what you do. And I think one of the ways that I see you do that is actually calling out some of your influences and your lineages, like on your website. You have an influences kind of page on your site where you really share who has gotten you to where you are today in your thinking. So how did that idea kind of emerge for you?
So I took a webinar with Kelly Deals, who brands herself as a feminist copywriter. And there was like a 3-hour workshop that I signed up for. And so she introduced it in that. And that's where I was first learned of it. She called it lineage. And I've seen other people use it too. And like, yeah, I just really appreciated being able to know like who influenced her, who, where she learned from. They were both like resources and also like an honoring and also a crediting, of her inspirations. And so I wanted to do something similar. I just wanted it to be, I use the term influences instead of lineage because I feel like lineage is a word I would have to unpack more before I'd be comfortable using that. And I wanted to, but I still wanted to keep like the core of the idea. So that's why I renamed it influences. And I give her credit for that as well. I think a lot of times, especially in the marketing world, we're sort of taught to just sort of brand ourselves like, oh, look, I just kind of popped out of this womb and I knew all this and I figured it all out on my own. And it's very like that individualism of white supremacy culture. Yeah. And I think it's an act of resistance to say, no, like I stand on the shoulders of giants and these are some of my teachers and these are some of, who I've learned from and built upon. And I continue to do so. And so that will be a never ending updated page of like who I'm learning from and who, in the hopes that it will help other people find resources that will help them as well,
Yes. I think it's a really community oriented, like it's a really beautiful practice. And it's actually really, and I say it's community oriented because by calling on them and even I don't know if you do this or not, but even building relationships with those influences, if they're still here on this earth, it can really help expand our reach in a way as well and build partnerships that then lead to more people getting help, getting well, starting to pursue this education on their own. So I think it's really powerful. Like as an example, I had Denise Brousseau on this podcast, who is the person who wrote the book that sparked my thought leadership journey back when I was still a nonprofit ED. And so to be in relationship with her and to really cite her as an influence, I think it does a lot to build community and build relationship in a really cool way, instead of pretending like I just came up with all this on my own, because I certainly didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. How cool that you get to like have a conversation with someone who like really influenced you. I'm not there yet. I don't have a podcast. So, and like Brene Brown don't know who I am. Maybe one day, right? Maybe one day I can aspire to that. But, regardless of whether or not they actually know who I am, I want to give credit where credit is due, right? Yeah. Like, this is where I first learned about it. They might not be the first person who's like ever thought of it, but that's where I learned it, right?
Yeah. So. Exactly. And so that's our tie to our, to our influence. And that's kind of not looking backwards per se, but looking at who's influenced us to get here. So the last question I always love to ask on this podcast is kind of more future oriented, which is really like, what is your big dreamy vision that you're working towards?
Yeah. I think that's such a big question. And I'm going to start off a little strange here, but I'm just going to name it as it is. Like, I'm a pragmatic optimist is what I call myself, right? So like, I am under no delusion that oppression will ever go away in my lifetime, or even my children's, grandchildren's, if I get any lifetime, right? That oppression is an infinite game, to quote Simon Sinek. And so given that that's kind of the game we're in, like, how do I help people free themselves? Like, how do I help them like unplug from the matrix so they can really what's happening and like make choices that align with who they are and how they want to show up and navigate this world, not how the rules that everyone's imposing and enforcing on them. And how can I help people get grounded in their wholeness and, you know, in their sacred spiritual, like capital S self, so that they are able to face and resist and, you know, continue the work of liberation for themselves and the people that they love.
Yeah.
And so that's, and, you know, one by one, I hope that I can have a ripple effect that, you know, that's my contribution to the fight against oppression, right?
Yeah.
I don't believe in being a superhero all by myself. Like, no, it takes all of us doing our work. And this is my contribution to that work.
Yeah. 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 Well, and I've seen that to be true. As soon as one person unplugs from the matrix, right, they are able to have that ripple effect in their life. It just like, it's like the root of a tree. It just passes on and passes on. So Emily, how can people get in touch with you and find you so that they can unplug from the matrix too?
Well, the best way to, I think, find me is on my website, myinvisiblenapsack.com. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn under Emily Roh, ROH. And I would love to, you know, just have a conversation if this is speaking to you with whoever's listening around this, because I love talking about this. So I welcome those messages.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I love listening to you talk about this, and what you do just, you know, it's working. It's working. So thank you for being here. I appreciate you so much for so many reasons. And I know this conversation is going to spark a lot of ears, if you will.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for this opportunity. And I've just really appreciated our whole collaborative relationship from beginning to end. It's felt really wonderful.
Likewise, my friend. And we'll see what's to come from here.
All right.
What'd you think? Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or even better, reach out and let me know through lumosmarketing.co. Yes, that's Lumos, as in the illumination spell from Harry Potter. Because when you shine, magical things happen. You can get social with me on LinkedIn, and of course, check out the show notes to stay in touch with our guests. Let's talk soon.